Thank you, and welcome to this panel called The Amazon Phenomenon. My name is Dayen. I'm a journalist with The Intercept and several other publications. I'm joined by this very illustrious panel who will introduce themselves. We did, several panelists did that yesterday, and it takes the pressure off me of not getting anything wrong, so I appreciate that. So I'm just going to start with some introductory remarks. So Amazon is a market maker. It is a seller that competes with the individual sellers on the marketplace it created. It's a shipper for those sellers. It's a lender to those sellers. It's a brick and mortar competitor to those sellers and other sellers. It's a data manager for those sellers and others. It's a search engine for those sellers, both online and through digital assistants. There are 100 million Prime subscribers worldwide, roughly the population of Germany. The physical Amazon bookstore, which seems to be largely a side project to promote and sell Prime subscriptions, is today already the fourth largest bookstore chain in the United States. Amazon is poised to comprise half of all e-commerce by 2021. It sells close to half of all books in the US. In 2016, studies showed that 55% of all shopping searches begin at Amazon. Alexa has 70% of the digital assistant market. A study this past Christmas said 76% of shoppers would do their holiday shopping on Amazon. A few years ago, Amazon created its own holiday, Prime Day, which is unusual for any company outside of Hallmark to create. And it's also a major television and film studio, and its owner controls a major newspaper. Many are concerned about Amazon's expression of economic and political power from holding, having all these tentacles. This includes its workers, which, based on Amazon's financial disclosure this week, they make on average $28,446 a year. This includes marketplace sellers being squeezed with high access fees, suppliers from manufacturers to publishers, retailers, cashiers, grocers, shippers, home security companies, defense contractors, commercial real estate owners, local governments not receiving commercial property taxes, local governments not receiving district taxes from e-commerce sales, local governments held up for economic development subsidies, states who see Amazon employees in the top 5 companies among SNAP recipients, pharmacies, pharmaceutical companies, PBMs who sit between the pharmacies and the pharmaceutical companies, academics, anti-monopoly advocates, and law students who write papers praised by the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust in the United States. But people love it. The 2018 Harris Poll Reputation Quotient Index put Amazon as the most admired company in America. It was #1 on the reputation quotient. Consumers are happy for the convenience. They in some cases, are willing to give access to their car trunks or homes to accept Amazon products. They clearly find value in the service. So as I invite the panel to introduce themselves, maybe we can start by having you just, in addition to the introduction, briefly answer the question, given that this is an antitrust and competition conference, and given what we've heard about the difference between competition and concentration and the limits, perhaps, of antitrust policy, should we be having a panel about Amazon at all at this conference? And if we should, what are the specific competition problems with Amazon that you would identify? So I'm going to start on the far end to answer that question. Introduce yourself and then answer that question briefly, and then we'll get on with other questions.
So I'm Joshua Gans. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I have been an expert and also researching, and both at the same time, on antitrust for almost 25 years now. And I'm particularly interested in the role and interplay between antitrust and innovation and innovative competition. And recently I'm very interested in AI and might have a bit to say about that later. In terms of should we be having a panel on Amazon, it's one of these same things we've had discussed before. Take almost any of the static criteria that we use for antitrust and try to think about the markets that Amazon are in and that they're really competing in. You know, the claims of Amazon being a monopoly are extremely strange. It's even strange to pick something out like voice assistants. Voice assistants, they're 76% of the market. That can't be true, because prior to having Alexa in our house, I would sit in the morning in front of the computer and I'd be reading my Twitter or news, and I'd hear, "Joshua, what's the weather?" It's going to be cold and snowy. "Joshua, can you order some more toilet paper?" Done. And then we got Alexa, and I was replaced. So that was a substitutable service, which it just goes to illustrate how hard it is to define these markets. Now, the other flip side of this is, of course, on the innovation and competition front. You know, Amazon, because it is a platform and because it is the largest e-commerce platform, means that it has both provided the cheapest means for people to sell online in many domains, and simultaneously that gives it an impact on the future state of e-commerce. And so we get into the issues that have been crowding out the last few days over what should we be doing regarding the risk equation for any, say, mergers and acquisitions by Amazon, and perhaps even other practices, including MFNs, in terms of its dynamic implications, even if we're not necessarily concerned about a leverage of monopoly in any given market.
I'm Austan Goolsbee. I'm a professor here at the University of Chicago Business School. I teach a class for the MBAs on platforms, and my research about the internet, empirical work on the internet, and about e-commerce goes back a long way to the old days. The first time we had the internet boom. I guess I would somewhat follow up from the previous comments. I think sort of three things. The first, we should have a panel about Amazon. If anything that's the biggest e-commerce seller is going to be of interest, but I want us to be a little careful. There are things that I'm concerned about, and there are things that I'm less concerned about as regards Amazon. Mm-hmm. The first is, a lot of what Amazon has gotten famous for is not really a platform. Okay, so just being a retailer, and the question of, is being an online retailer a lower cost proposition than being a brick and mortar retailer, and was it fair to go for so long that they weren't paying sales tax, and now that they are mostly paying sales tax, can bookstores or grocery stores or somebody else survive in a world where they're competing against online? I don't view that as predominantly an anti-competitive thing at all. That's mostly not about their behavior as a platform. The reason to be concerned about platforms is the role of network externalities. Does that give them market power that they can use to stifle innovation or to penalize the customers in some way, or engage in some anti-competitive practices? I'll talk in my third point about what I think we might want to keep our ears to the ground for on that front. But my starting point is, it's not if you go look at the newspaper and the question of, is this industry about to be Amazoned, that is mostly in the style of what Jean Tirole kind of just told us about Uber, where he observed the technology of Uber, there's nothing tremendously advanced about that. And in a way, the incumbent taxi monopolies could have done that, and they chose not to. They never did it. So you at least have to count that there are benefits on that side. And in this case, your local grocery store could have moved to have delivery, could have moved to have online delivery. They have chosen not to do that for a long time for various reasons we can get into. If Amazon is going to come in and through a purchase of Whole Foods or others is going to make it easy for the delivery of groceries to your house using technologies that anybody could have used before, you at least have to count that as a benefit before thinking about the anti-competitive side of it. Amazon's launched many things that did not succeed, that failed. They launched a phone. The phone was terrible. People didn't use it. It was done. They launched the tablet devices. The first several versions, if not bombed, they didn't succeed very well. They're getting a little better, but there's no evidence that they're able to just choose anything they want and take it over. And e-commerce is still 9% of retail in the United States. So the thought that they're a big retailer and they're taking over the whole world, if you go look at the census data, that part is not true. I think the aspects, point two, what should we think about the benefit side before we think about the anti-competitive side? I've got this paper with Pete Cleanow at Stanford where we got a bunch of data online. It's not specifically about Amazon. It's through a different provider. We got data on about a third of the e-commerce physical product sales that take place online. The inflation rate of online goods is about 150 basis for this. We just have a panel from 2014 to 2017. In that period, the inflation rate is about 150 basis points a year more deflation than what the CPI says on those categories. There has been, that's not sustainable forever because in 20 years, everything would be free online. But for whatever reason, during this period, there's been massive deflation, massively lower prices, and prices falling much more online than in retail stores. And there's been another 150 basis points a year equivalent extra deflation from massive entry of new products. The benefits of Amazon are used a lot by urban customers, but you should not make light of the consumer surplus gains from people in smaller towns, suburbs, places where you couldn't get the extensive varieties that now you can get as a matter of course. So all of those count for pretty significant consumer benefits. So before somebody says we need to stop Amazon and break them up and change them, I do think we want to think about the positive side. Now, on the negative side, the part that I think we want to be highly attuned to paying attention to. One is Fiona Scott Morton yesterday on her panel mentioned in passing the issue that if you run the platform, if we find what Amazon's doing is accepting a bunch of merchants, those merchants come in with new products and then Amazon sees what can sell and then copies it and contracts out counterfeit, imitation, however you want to call those, and undermines the incentives for competition, that would probably have a pretty significant, over the long run, negative impact on consumers. If they run the platform and there's a bigger rise of this, call it the private label version of the products from Amazon, I think that's something that we should pay attention to. And two, the rise of these digital assistants, whatever you want to call them, old-fashioned bread and butter, anti-competitive type conduct of the form, Alexa, I need a new iPhone cord. Alexa says, we have Amazon Basics cord for $12.99. No, Alexa, I would like an Anchor cord. I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you just said. We have an Amazon Basics cord for $12.99. Now, actually we laugh, but the rumor is that it has already begun happening. And what's happening there is we're freely creating market power by moving more and more of our commerce into these dominated platforms. There's a faculty member down at Chicago named Joe Vebber who has a paper that got the Nielsen home scan data and goes and asks the question for each of us in our households, if you look at what people buy, how concentrated have our own purchases gotten by brand? And the answer is, over the last 15 years, we have all gotten more and more concentrated. If you go back 15 years ago, we used to buy 3 different kinds of cereals. Now we buy 1 type of cereal. When we look at shampoos, we used to buy more varieties, and we've chosen to concentrate more and more. And his argument is that's part of why you've seen markups rise, is we gave them market power by concentrating our demand more and more to these individual firms. And I fear we might be doing that some with the retail channels too.
Okay. I have a lot that I want to respond to that, but I'm going to let everybody sort of get a turn here of sort of framing this. Hopefully it will be a little shorter to frame it, but and then we'll like launch in. So go ahead, Lena. Should we be here? Why are we here?
Yeah, I'm Lena Khan. I'm Director of Legal Policy for the Open Markets Institute and a visiting fellow at Yale Law School. I think we should be here. I think a first order question is, how do we know when something is a competition or antitrust issue? And I think one key measure of that is to ask, if you have a company or an independent producer who wants to bring a good to market and is able to secure funding for that good, is it able, in fact, to bring that good to market and compete on the merits? And I think given the role and the structure of Amazon, the answer is increasingly no. I think increasingly businesses are not able to compete on the merits with Amazon. I wrote a piece called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox that tells the story of Amazon's rise and identifies 2 key strategies that Amazon used to reach the position that it enjoys today. One of those strategies is predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is something that used to be illegal under antitrust laws. It's in theory still illegal, but given how the Supreme Court has changed the doctrine, it's much more difficult to bring a case. There are key instances in which Amazon established dominance in certain lines of businesses through pricing goods below cost. The evidence also suggests that in some of those instances it then went on to actually raise costs, but in ways that are not as immediately discernible as they might have been with, say, a brick and mortar store. The other key strategy for Amazon has been vertical integration. So as Dave mentioned, Amazon is this platform, but that it's integrated in all these other lines of business. That structure puts it in direct competition with companies, and Amazon has been a master of leveraging its dominance in one sector to enjoy dominant positions in other sectors. One key way is through information. So it uses information in the marketplace to inform its private label production. It also, there was a story a few years ago that where you had Amazon Web Services executive noting that Amazon tracks which startups are increasing their use of AWS most quickly and uses that information to then inform which companies it's going to invest in through its venture capital arm. So I think there's actually cross-leveraging of information in all sorts of ways that we probably just have a very little amount of insight into. I think when having this conversation, it's important to also ask, is competition and is antitrust the only tool to be using when thinking about Amazon? I think given network effects, given the fact that platforms in many ways are these winner-take-all markets, it's very possible that Amazon's platform in and of itself is something that we might want to keep at the scale that it is. I think in that instance, we need to ensure that it's not able to abuse the power that it has in this one sector to expand into other sectors. And this is something that we've done historically. In the 60s and 70s, the FCC had what it called the computer inquiries, where it noted that, we're seeing the rise of this new data processing sector, but we're going to see AT&T and all these incumbent monopolies kind of get in there, and that's going to tilt the market. So they imposed rules that basically prevented dominant incumbent carriers from directly getting involved in data processing. So I think there's a long history of kind of structural separations and ensuring that what are kind of dominant platforms are not using that dominance to make other markets anti-competitive, kind of expand into those markets anti-competitive ways. And I think that's some of what we need to be thinking about with Amazon.
Maurice?
All right, well, thank you. My name is Maurice Stucke. I'm a professor at University of Tennessee. I'm also of Counsel of the Konkurrenz group. I've written with Ariel Izraki, who will be on the next panel, Virtual Competition, and then with Alan Grinnis, Big Data and Competition Policy. So we've got two bodies of research that deal with this issue, should we be here today? And the answer is yes. And so the first is, what are the harm of what we call these dataopolies? And one of the things that we've heard is, well, dataopolies, they offer their products ostensibly for free, and the quality of the product can actually improve as a result of these network effects. So there's a very short version in the Harvard Business Review where we identify at least 8 potential harms from these dataopolies. And these are some of the themes we've been hearing over the last day and a half. So the first is less privacy. Second is the surveillance implications, particularly like with China. Third would be wealth transfers to dataopolies, and this can be both upstream as well as downstream through behavioral discrimination, which is a more pernicious form of price discrimination. We also look at a deadweight welfare loss in terms of a loss of trust. We can also see how these super platforms can impose significant costs on third parties. Then there's also the possibility of less innovation, and we call this the nowcasting radar. And Lena pointed this out, is by having access to this data, they can see in real time who are the nascent competitive threats, and they can either acquire them or they can use then measures then to squelch them. And then you can have then the social and moral concerns. And this came out, I thought, in the first panel yesterday, where they were talking about making these products purposefully addictive, which is really interesting because you'd think as a monopoly you wouldn't have to do that. But their profit incentives could be aligned in order to increase your engagement with their platform. And then finally, we heard this over the past day and a half, are the political concerns. So those are sort of the overarching concerns that these dataopolies possess. Then the question is, going forward, we went from a PC world to a phone world, and now we're going into a voice world, and it's the digital personal assistants. And what you see with these, Ariel and I have written several articles on this, is what you see with these digital personal assistants are several network effects. And what you're likely going to see is 1 or 2 dominant digital assistants. And then what are then the antitrust implications when you have 1 or 2 dominant personal assistants? And as we point out, it's not only going to be economic, it's going to affect your privacy. There's likely going to be social and moral concerns as well as political concerns.
Great. Ben, you can just wrap this up.
I'm Ben Thompson, write Stratechery.com about technology and strategy and its implications on society. I obviously spoke yesterday, so I will leave it at that. I think to Josh's point, any sort of empirical measurement, the answer is clearly no. Amazon has 4% of retail in the United States, which is certainly impressive, but is difficult to say crosses the threshold of being a monopoly. Similarly, in the case of voice assistants, the 70% is a very impressive number. But given how nascent the category is, should we be moving so quickly in a sort of regulatory fashion? That said, I do think the answer is yes, and the answer is yes because it is not a static market; it is a dynamic market. And I think a big problem with Amazon generally is just a widespread sort of misunderstanding of what the company is and what it does. There's a very famous quote from Matthew Iglesias that Amazon, as best I can tell, is a charitable organization being run by elements of the investment community for the benefits of consumers. And Matt is a brilliant writer, which is unfortunate in this case because I think this has led to an increased lack of knowledge in the case of Amazon. I abide by the precept that people are not stupid, and that includes Amazon's investors. I think what makes it tricky is Amazon has fundamentally changed the sort of company it is over time. Amazon started out as an e-commerce retailer. And like any retailer, they bought products and they sold them on. Now, how they actually did that with books, with being a drop shipping and things like that, is much more complicated. But by and large, their the way they planned to make money was to earn a margin on the products that they sold. And they actually did make a significant margin. Amazon made money for quite early on a unit basis and for a long time selling books and CDs and DVDs. In fact, they took that money and then they used that money to invest in other parts of the business, primarily moving into goods, that being electronics, being tools, things along those natures. They did that in 1999. And that part of the company was, on a unit basis, was bordering on unprofitable, if not unprofitable. And what happened was that part of the company was growing significantly while books and CDs and DVDs was either staying level or it was in secular decline because of the advent of digital technology. And what happened was Amazon made a really fundamental pivot in its business model in around 2005. They introduced three things. 2005, they introduced Amazon Prime. 2006, they introduced Amazon Merchant Services. In 2007, they introduced AWS. It is striking that there has been only maybe a one mention in passing of AWS, because AWS is arguably the single most important element of Amazon. It's the most important from a financial perspective, and it's the most important from understanding the company. From a financial perspective, AWS is immensely profitable. Last year, it produced $4.3 billion in profit on $17 billion of revenue. You can do the calculation. That is a very impressive margin. And that margin, that profit more than pays for the rest of the company. Amazon's e-commerce business was negative by $300 million. However, it's worth splitting that out. The North American business was profitable by $2.8 billion, and the international business was lost $3.1 billion, primarily due to significant investment in India, which they look likely to succeed in. So so number one, it's different businesses, and this is Lena's point that they may fund each other. But two, the way to think about AWS is the driving insight of AWS was this idea that instead of building a big integrated operation that Amazon had for its e-commerce services, it would be much more fruitful and beneficial to build what they called primitives. Build compute capacity, build database capacity, build storage capacity. And the idea would be not to that these primitives, they could build any sort of technology on top of them by walking up to them and plugging in like puzzle pieces into the different pieces that they needed. And they were standardized interfaces, fully modularized. And this reflected actually the internal structure of Amazon. Amazon has always been a very modular, teams are independent, have their own P&Ls, very separate company. It's like the anti-Apple. It's the exact opposite sort of company. And by building these sort of primitives, they could open up to third-party developers to build on top of it. And that's exactly what AWS did. And it's been phenomenally successful. Since then, Amazon has done the same thing to the rest of their business. Their e-commerce business, starting as an integrated model where they would take a margin, has shifted to this merchant model. Last year, across over 50% of revenue came from merchant services, again, by Amazon offering standardized interfaces, standardized pieces that any merchant could walk up to on a self-serve basis, sign up for, put their products there, and go through. They're going to do the same thing in logistics. You're aware of their buying planes, buying trucks, all these sorts of things. The long term seems clear is going to be standardized interfaces, standardized pieces, anyone can walk up to and use them. Now, certainly there are important considerations here, and they have been mentioned, the question of private labels, the question of gaining data and whatnot. But I see so much of the rhetoric on Amazon is focused on one, oh, they're just losing money and it's unfair, when the reality is Amazon's long-term goal, and this sounds hyperbolic, but I think it's quite sincere, is to take I call it a tax, but to take a percentage of basically all economic activity in the United States. Now, limitation is that's hard to do because you have to build out tremendous amounts of infrastructure. Amazon's spending is astronomical. The amount of money they put in to build these out is huge. But there's an implication there that is that such a bad thing? So much of the criticism of Amazon skirts the line of being really good at business is bad. And I think that's something to be very wary of here. Amazon, to their credit, is tremendously patient, communicates well what they want to do, and is very consistent in how they approach these markets in a way that investors do understand and are willing to, in the best possible idea of capital and investment, give them what they need to accomplish those sort of goals.
Okay. Well, I think that's good. We now have sort of a baseline of where everybody is at on this panel, and we certainly have a wide variety of opinion. I want to start and go back to Lena because, this idea from some circles of the change, this desire to maybe change or alter or augment the consumer welfare standard is something that has come up in previous panels, and I think it's painted with a very broad brush with respect to people at open markets and people like yourself. And if you could just sort of clarify the position of what you believe with respect to Amazon, where the standard is either lacking or needs some sort of enhancement, and what you would see that to look like to sort of cut through this idea that, oh, they want to throw out the consumer welfare standard. What are you really in for there?
Sure. So the consumer welfare standard can, in theory, encompass a set of factors, including things like quality and innovation. But in practice, it generally gravitates towards looking at price effects, effects on price and output. And one of the arguments I make in this piece is that that consumer welfare frame is really insufficient for capturing the structural power that Amazon has amassed in particular markets. And I think Ben's point is interesting. You know, I think the fact that Amazon's trying to tax all this economic activity goes to a deeper question, which is Amazon in certain areas actually an infrastructure company? And if so, then we usually treat infrastructure companies very different than we do, say, a Macy's or a Sears or kind of a retailer. And so if Amazon has in fact morphed beyond what we initially thought it was, maybe we need to think more broadly. But I think back to the consumer welfare question, it's interesting. So consumer welfare is nowhere in the statutory language of the antitrust laws. How did we get it? We got it because judges and a certain set of scholars decided that the idea of competition is really too vague, that the statutes are written in a very broad way, and so we really need a proxy for what competition is. And they decided that consumer welfare is a good proxy. I think we've been living under a 40-year natural experiment where we've applied the consumer welfare approach, and all around us I think we're starting to see declining competition. And so I think that's kind of gets us to a deeper question, which is, how do you actually, if consumer welfare is in fact not a good proxy for competition, what is a good proxy? And I think it's interesting because a lot of the language of a lot of court decisions go to talking about the competitive process. And when you're trying to do antitrust, you're really trying to ensure the integrity of competition of the competitive process, but consumer welfare is not really sufficient to capture that. And so I think Amazon is a useful example because it shows how you need to be thinking about different forms of market power and how to capture those, and I think those get cashed out in a variety of ways, but things like looking at kind of the difference in bargaining power, the kinds of conflicts of interest that can be emerging, how what capacity a company has to leverage dominance across sectors. So I think thinking about what are our measures of market power that are not being captured under the consumer welfare framework is something that Amazon kind of prompts us to ask.
And so, because the common critique there is that now you're opening it, it's the Wild West. You're opening this up to all these other sort of social or maybe political goals, and we have to rein this in. I mean, that's usually, to play devil's advocate, the critique that's given. How do we balance wanting to capture these things that are happening that may be not preferred and not tipping the line to these larger potential dangers from opening up the standard?
Right. I mean, I think we're in some ways already in the wild, wild west. I mean, I think there's this false dichotomy between this very scientific certain approach, which is the consumer welfare approach, and then everything else is just this totally indeterminate kind of system. But I think if you look at kind of how the rule of reason gets applied, how consumer welfare gets calculated, I mean, there's a lot of indeterminacy in the current approach. I also think looking at the competitive process is not the same as kind of opening up antitrust analysis to thinking about all sorts of factors like effects on wages or jobs or political power. I think these things get conflated often because a lot of the renewed political interest in antitrust is coming from a recognition that actually concentrated economic power has all these other social and political effects. But that's not to say that all of those effects should then be incorporated into antitrust analysis from the get-go. So I think there's a very clear difference there.
Okay, great. And I know, Maurice, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just 3 points on this. Well, first thing, that everyone loves the consumer welfare standard because it means different things to different people. I mean, the ICN did a survey, and it was the second most popular goal. And the reason is that different people imported their values to it. The second thing then is that the consumer welfare standard cannot be the standard because competition is concerned also about upstream effects that may not affect the consumer. So the DOJ is now prosecuting anti-poaching agreements. There may be no effect downstream, but that is well recognized within competition law. So people say, yes, it's consumer welfare, but we also are concerned about things that might happen to farmers and the like. And then the third thing is, I mean, it came up yesterday. It's like, oh, the wild, wild west. Well, you have the rule of reason standard, and that's true if you have multiple goals and an open weighing test. But, I mean, going back to the political content of Antitrust with Petoskey, that he warned about if you fail to take account these political issues, you're going to end up in the result where you're going to have regulations, what we're talking about today. But the second thing is that you can account for the multiple goals through legal standards, presumptions, and that's what we used to have. We used to have like presumptions against certain practices, and that purely wasn't, for allocative efficiency, dynamic efficiency, or something else. It was to accommodate these different values, and that's what we could go to. So, and actually, you can have bringing antitrust closer to rule of law principles by taking into account these multiple goals into simpler legal presumptions.
Okay. I want to bring it back to Amazon a little bit here. And actually, just to follow up with Maurice, so somebody showed me this. This was the spring edition of the Chicago Booth Review, and the cover says, "Are you ready for personalized pricing?" And I just want to know, Maurice, are you ready for personalized pricing? And what do you think would be the effect of that on Amazon?
Right. So this is something that Ariel and I, in our book, Virtual Competition, we tackle. So we look at, with the rise of data and the ability to profile individuals, are we going to get closer to first-degree price discrimination? And in speaking with the people within the industry, what we found is, in some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. But we're going to get closer to it. But there's going to be really two components to this. And to use our sort of Fight Club slogan, it's basically getting you to buy things that you otherwise would not have wanted at the highest price you're willing to pay. So price discrimination can be pro-competitive. I mean, for all of us right now paying college tuition, we're not arguing about price discrimination. But it can be quite sinister when you're being manipulated to purchase products and then paying a higher price. So one of the things that the article points out is that companies are starting to have the ability to price discriminate. And one of the problems in doing so is that while economists are agnostic about it, many consumers think that it's unfair in many different settings. And so that's the resistance for some companies to implement it. But what we argue is that with the shift to dynamic pricing, where you go online and you're already seeing different pricing, and it's because of market sectors, it's going to be easier then for companies to engage in price discrimination. And I think you've seen this already with Uber, with some of the allegations against Uber, that now it's covertly going from dynamic pricing to also price discrimination. And the welfare effects here are less clear when you're induced to buy something at a moment of vulnerability.
Right. Austan, since you talked about this study that you were talking about with deflation happening in here, is the possibility of very personalized, maybe through the assistant, price discrimination, is that something that we should be concerned about yet, or not something?
I think for sure we should be concerned about the possibility of rising market power and if they're doing something to harm consumers. As you know, I served in the Obama administration. I'm a Democrat. I'm quite sympathetic to we need to be a little tougher on monopolies and try to reduce markups and market power. Personally, I'm not as big a fan of the let's abandon the consumer welfare standard for two reasons. One, the consumer welfare standard exists because the natural alternative is a producer welfare standard, or to include producer welfare. And the history is terrible about that. because when the merger comes in, what is it that prevents the merging companies of saying, there will be massive efficiencies, we're going to save so much cost, we're going to do the greatest job in the world, it's going to enhance the producers. We inherently give them very little credit for that, and I think we shouldn't give them very much credit for that. You should have to show quantity is going to go up, innovation is going to be improved, there are going to be improvements to the consumer side. That's how I think we got to the consumer standard. Now, I think the argument that if people interpret consumer welfare standard to just be about price, that's a mistake. That's wrong. Even theoretically, that's not correct. We should include innovation. We should include quality and those others. But I fear two slippery slopes. One is the giving way too much credit to producer welfare in computing the benefits. And then the other is we have agencies that evaluate mergers not on a consumer welfare standard. If you have a media merger, it goes through the FCC. They don't have a merger guidelines. Right. They can include anything they want. And anybody who says we should have a different standard, I invite them to go look at the kinds of demands that these other agencies put on mergers. They're highly political. They do very much trend to and then the merging parties themselves say things like, we will satisfy the Obama administration's broadband goal if you let us do this merger. And so the trend toward rent seeking, I think you can't dismiss those.
Right. I was talking about more along the lines of what Maurice was saying, which is the rise of technology and the ability for personalization being something that would be a very direct harm to consumers.
And I am nervous about that.
Right.
And to the extent that what that is, in that case, the price discrimination is merely reflecting they've increased their market power. If firms are increasing their market power and thereby charging higher prices to consumers, I think we should be very
But given that you
concerned.
don't see it in the data right now, because I mean you've just sort of described that data. Like for example, your former colleague Jason Furman used to make this sort of case for Walmart that people had. There were certainly critics of that, but can the same case at this moment in time be made for Amazon if it's creating this sort of ability to lower prices?
That's what I think. I probably didn't state it clearly enough. That's what I meant when I said you at least got to add up the benefits side.
Right.
If you went to people and said, we're not going to let you, to help you, we're going to break up Amazon and you're not going to be able to order all of this stuff from the same site. You're going to have to go to multiple sites. You will get a lot of pushback from consumers. And I think if you look at quantities are up. So the argument that they're restricting supply and harming consumers, I think your presumption's got to be thus far that hasn't really.
That's why I'm asking if all things considered, you would make the parallel case that Furman did on Walmart right now with respect to Amazon. Taking the good and bad.
So far they've increased consumer
there's
surplus.
a case for it.
Yeah, I think so far they've increased consumer surplus, but I do think we should be highly attuned to rise of market power.
All right, great. I want to go to Ben. When you think about Amazon, you think about these sort of offline effects on retailers, effects on all the sort of different professions that I mentioned before. But, Amazon didn't get mentioned a ton in the first day or so of this conference, although there are similarities. I mean, Amazon is a form of search engine. You have described Alexa as kind of the OS of Amazon. There's a use of recommendations and wish lists. I mean, there is a social network component to this. There's a data component to this, obviously, as has been talked about. They're an emerging advertiser. So do the same structures come up with respect to Amazon that drove some of the concerns that we saw in the first 2 days of this conference?
There are similarities in how they sort of accrue the power they have in their relevant market. In that Amazon succeeds by delivering a product that consumers like, that brings suppliers onto their platform, that makes Amazon more attractive to consumers, bring on more consumers, and getting that sort of virtuous cycle. And again, it's an example like Google and Facebook, where the power on the internet comes not from controlling supply, but from controlling demand.
Right.
And that brings them on your platform. The difference, though, is for one, the business model is quite obviously different. I mean, yes, Amazon is increasing its advertising spend or its advertising revenue. Nearly all of that is on Amazon itself. I mean,
right.
and there's an aspect of Amazon, and you mentioned the dataopoly issue. Reed Hastings of Netflix said a few days ago that we feel inoculated from this controversy because we're not using data elsewhere. And the reality is Netflix is accumulating all kinds of data, and data is critical to their business, but it's completely self-contained within Netflix itself.
Right.
And that's, I would say, a similar thing with Amazon. What's interesting, though, and the reason why I wanted to make that point before about Amazon, to your point, Lena, I absolutely believe Amazon is an infrastructure company. And to the extent they are a retail company, that's more a vestige of where they were. And I think they're going in the opposite direction. The reason why that matters is, from an antitrust perspective, in the long run, Amazon is far more interesting than Google or Facebook. Google and Facebook, I think, to some extent, are as I think the most interesting takeaway from this conference is the sort of dawning on people that they are much more political problems and centralization of political power and influence, and ought to be dealt with from this sort of legislative approach. Whereas Amazon, if you start with the supposition it is an infrastructure company, and they are able to use that to exercise control in these sorts of ways. And again, Lena's piece is really great. I'm sure everyone's read it, but just make sure you have. I think the two most compelling examples of Amazon acting poorly are ebooks, one, which is probably one of the most compelling cases about the consumer welfare standard being problematic. That somehow introducing competition in the market was found to be the problem. Right. But number two is the Kidsy purchase, Diapers.com, where in here this does tie yesterday, where the problem is the M&A sort of the way the Justice Department is thinking about M&A is perhaps insufficient to what's going forward. But those are very clear-cut, sort of fit in the antitrust toolbox, where these are problematic in a way that so many of the Google and Facebook questions do not. And so they are similar in the way they work, but arguably Amazon is more relevant to this conference than the other two, at least in the long run. That goes back to the point. Right now, their share is so small, but if you follow the trajectory of where they're going, it is certainly something we're thinking about.
So Lena brought up this thing, and actually maybe I'll bring in Joshua. Actually, I'll go with you, and then we'll go to the AI thing. Lena brought up this idea of structural separation, this idea that if you're going to be an infrastructure company, be an infrastructure company. But if you're selling on this platform and competing with the very people that you are supplying the infrastructure for, and acquiring all the data off that and then knowing exactly what markets to get into or jump out of, that's problematic from a competition standpoint. What is your take on that?
It certainly is problematic. I'm not saying it is prima facie wrong.
Right.
There's an example, like, what was it called, Pillow Pets or something that you had in there. That was kind of, Amazon's really never done that otherwise. It was pretty egregious. Perhaps they have, but they're
maybe explain for
Lena, you should
or
explain.
Lena should explain.
You know it better.
Sure. So there have been many examples, actually, not just with Pillow Pets, where you have independent business that's selling through Amazon Marketplace, which is where 2 to 3 million retailers reach consumers. And Amazon saw that this product was doing well, and then they ended up going directly to the manufacturer, selling it itself, undercutting them, kind of lowering where they show up in rank. And now they're doing it with their private label.
Yes, which is exactly right. When I meant they haven't done it, I think that was relative to the other ones was the egregiousness was pretty extreme. I think they probably learned their lesson. We can't go so extreme. But your point is well taken, and I completely agree with the private label questions are significant ones. At the same time, a good number of Amazon's private label offerings are a tremendous relief to have in the market. Take their Amazon Basics, most famous for cables, which is sort of rife with bad marketing and huge markups, and to know that you can go and get a stupid iPhone charger and the Amazon one's going to be consistent. Like that, from a consumer perspective, I kind of appreciate that. Now again, that is an aside to note that it is a big question. It is a big concern. I think the private label issue, which Amazon is certainly expanding, is problematic. And frankly, I think though, the key thing to keep in mind is, suppose Amazon did receive some sort of antitrust pressure about private labels. I think they would give up private labels in a moment. Again, because the point being is Amazon is not leveraging its platform to become a retailer. To the extent they're doing that, it is more of a, again, Amazon has all these little entities. Amazon's like a corporate VC company where they take profitable internal companies to fund all sort of new experiments internally. And maybe the private label team is going crazy and doing all that sort of stuff, and they do have access to all this sort of internal infrastructure. But the long-term big picture trend for Amazon is actually to go in the opposite direction. And so, so all to say, I agree, but let's not lose sight of what they actually are and what they're trying to build.
Right. I think I have some things to say on that, but I'm going to put a pause in it and go to Joshua. Do you have something on that?
Yeah,
or-
I've got something on the, just before. Regarding the consumer welfare standard and the weakening of antitrust policy, I guess having sat here for 2 days, my advice to the US, and I know that's not possible. Amazon actually has come up to the presidential level to argue about the allocation of common costs in the postal service, and I don't think anyone had that in the pool for what was going to be an issue. But when it comes down to it, you've got a terrible antitrust regime. It's terribly, terribly weak. I can't fathom all of the examples we've heard just far. If they went in a real antitrust regime, such as exists in Australia, where I was for 15 years, where this was top of mind, the competition authorities would have been on that. These would have been issues that would have been there. They are not afraid to litigate people for predatory pricing when they've only got 30% of the market. They're not afraid to do these sorts of things, and it's fundamentally changed the culture of that. There's a reason why Amazon has been doing these things inside the US, but when it operates outside of the US, it doesn't. It's because we have different regimes going on there. And it's nothing to do with the consumer welfare standard. Nobody is more adherent to the consumer welfare standard than is the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. That's its whole thing. So I think you have to sort of look and say, basically, the United States has chosen not to deal with these things. And moreover, and it's going to come with the infrastructure as well, Amazon has placed itself by good actions, AWS, allowing a whole class of startups to be able to scale up and enter very easily. That's been a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it's had a measurable impact on innovation. My colleague Christine McCulloughan has demonstrated that. Amazon allowing third-party sellers also that way. But also, this is great. It makes it so easy when they grow and they start doing this sort of crap to be able to call them out for it, because it's a change in practice. It's an obvious diversion there. So I kind of think, it's not that hard an issue. I'll tell you what gets hard an issue is when you think about Amazon as integrating through such a large part of the economy. There is competition to Amazon. It's coming up slowly. It's not in the same way. I should declare I do some work from time to time with a Canadian, we now still call it a startup, Shopify. Shopify enables businesses to get online and get online very quickly. There's 600,000 of them around the world. But they go fully off the backs of Facebook and Instagram advertising. Whatever it was that Facebook and Instagram managed to do in advertising allowed entry by all of these other firms in order to effectively compete with Amazon. The biggest first impact, if you broke up Facebook and Instagram, would be that would get lost. Because you'd have to work out, as Jean was already talking about, where's the ad platform going to go in all this? Can that be split? And that would have an impact on competition with Amazon. So these things are all related to one another, and that's sort of like the difficult part here. But in terms of just like throwing a flag when these issues come up, or dealing with some of these acquisitions, that's like
Well, I think
child's
it goes
play.
I think it goes a step further than that. I mean, we had a panel, just the last panel, on political capture and these ideas. I mean, Amazon in many ways has been reliant on government neglect or in some cases specific largesse for many years, whether it's not being able to have to collect sales taxes, giving them a permanent price advantage, then collecting the sales taxes, making all these deals to delay the collection, to make sure that they can collect on their own behalf, but not on behalf of third parties, which is half of the marketplace. The contracts that they've been able to receive for AWS, there's a big $10 billion cloud contract they're in the running for. There's an amendment that was put into the defense bill that allows the marketplace to be the procurement engine for the DoD. I think it goes beyond just they haven't had their wrists slapped. They've been
in something like that. If we take any very large company, GE, whatever, you will be able to say, look, they're in 20 different lines of business and they're making engines and they have something. So it's the AWS line of business. Is that even a platform business? Mostly that's just like a build out capacity and
sounds like something you could split off then.
It might be, but the argument that part is a digital platform where there's a network externality or something. That one's a bit of a stretch.
And you can make that point, but Amazon is the #1 recipient of state-based subsidies for the, and this is a little more old school, but for the deployment of their warehouses. They've made over $1 billion, and then you have HQ2, where they're being offered $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 billion to place that, and it really seems to be a data collection strategy to put out these bids to 200 people all across the country and see how much they will offer you, and then you can go back later and say, well, we didn't give you the headquarters, but we'll give you a warehouse, and we want that same deal. It seems to me that we don't talk a lot about the states. We haven't talked a lot about the states in this context, but what Amazon has been able to do to sort of intimidate these states
it's not quite intimidate. That's a cleverness. There's some of that that'll backfire on them, but some of it will work. I mean, I don't think they've ever given any indication that they're anything other than a complete shark when it comes to a company. In terms of that's the thing. In fact, if you type in now, the original name for Amazon, which already connotes some goals there, was posited to be Relentless.
Yeah.
That was going to be it. So if you go to relentless.com, you'll see where that takes you still right now. The idea, so that is their motive.
Absolutely.
And so we get good things and we get bad things from that. I mean, and I understand, and I'm not, who can solve, every country has their stupidities with regard to political capture and other things like that, and some muddle through it and some don't. But when it comes to Amazon, you're getting the benefit as well as the cost with that sharkiness, if we're going to call it. The cost are these sorts of things: playing off states, having fun, blah blah blah. Doing these little things at a line item stage that are not good. The benefits of it are huge. Because basically, near as I can tell, something, and I don't know if someone's going to, maybe Aaron Sorkin will do a movie about Jeff Bezos that he just had terrible shopping experiences as a child. Because basically, near as I can tell, Amazon have conducted a war on shopping. They want to stop you shopping. Shopping is bad. Basically, they've taken it out of the stores because it was time consuming, and they're putting it into your homes. And increasingly, and we talk about this in my book, available on Amazon Prediction Machines. I'm going to advertise. We're talking with modern AI. Amazon is learning more and more about you, and yeah, we can think about that in terms of personalized pricing, but it's more in learning what you want when you want. The biggest constraint Amazon faces right now is if you've got a hankering for a donut, it's easy to go down to the store. Then it is, they can't ship it to you. They can do that with toothpaste. They can't do it with other things. So with modern AI, which is all about predicting what your things are, in this case, what your demand might be, You can imagine that as that improves, as you improve the dial of modern AI, Amazon may get rid of shopping entirely. Amazon may instead know so much about you and what you want, it won't be Alexa delivering it. You'll come home and there'll be a box sitting there. Ah, it's from Amazon. You open it up and you'll say, oh, good. I was just out of, dental floss. I was just, this. Oh, look, there's this for dinner tonight. Yeah, I'll cook that. And you can choose to put it back in, but Amazon will be so assured that you're likely to take it that they may well just change the whole equation there. That's what you get from the relentless bit. And so I guess I'm in the mode of, how you can't just separate out the balance of these things when we sort of whine about their political behavior. That's all. It's the same quality.
You've certainly laid out the benefits of that, and I think Maurice is going to lay out some of the costs. So, I mean, one application of this is Amazon Go, right? I mean, this is a store that has no lines. You go in, you get what you want, and you come out.
Right.
And you see no price. It's a completely frictionless experience. And I'm wondering, Maurice, since you're,
See the price. I've been in Seattle. You do see the price.
You see the price.
Okay, you see the price on the price tag.
Yeah, except that you have to give the credit card and the app before.
There it is.
If you don't have an iPhone and a credit card, you're out of that store.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an experiment.
No, I
Yes.
understand,
Yeah.
but
That
But
hasn't
but
necessarily
it's
succeeded.
but it's exactly the experiment that you're leading to in
Sure.
some
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, I know,
and
yeah.
I want to bring in Maurice and ask him, what are the things we should be thinking about when Josh was talking about benefits of that. What is the other side?
All right, so there are several costs. And I mean, since we're here in Chicago, go back to Hayek, and when he got the Nobel Prize, he says that one of the problems with economics is that what's measurable has become really what's important. That with the other sciences, what's measurable is often what's important, but with economics, it's not always what's important. So here, what are some of the potential harms? And one of the harms is privacy, right? And this came up in Arkansas where a person was found dead in a hot tub. Turns out that they had one of these echo devices, and the police then subpoenaed it. And so now this was like the first test cases. The data is not stored on the echo device, it's stored with Amazon. And to what extent can the police then get that data? And what should be the standard that's applied? And it was very telling that when Amazon was in the Arkansas State Court, they said that if this data were released to the police, that this would basically allow someone to reconstruct one's life. And you're thinking about these digital assistants that are going to be in a children's room. They're going to basically know the child better than the child himself or herself. So there are these privacy costs. And we don't know necessarily how to quantify them, but nonetheless, that is a potential concern. Then you look at the economic costs, and the economic costs can be both upstream and downstream. So one of the things that Ariel and I have done is looking at upstream effects. And one thing that was really telling us with authors that publish through Amazon is to the extent that Amazon could squeeze them. And Amazon was paying these authors by the number of pages that you read a book online. So if you don't read the entire book, then they don't get the full amount. They only get the amount that you read. And now you're wondering that to the extent that they can use their power to squeeze upstream suppliers, particularly when they reduce friction, and now it becomes the essential gateway. So you no longer just go online and search. And think about the Google search case. There was people didn't go to the fourth page. But with these digital assistants, you're not even going to have 4 pages. You're likely to have your digital assistant offer 1 or 2, and it already came out in the first panel that Amazon is favoring some of its own products. So its gatekeeper role is going to increase. That includes the ability to discriminate as well as to charge fees. And then downstream, you're going to have then to what extent they can engage in behavioral discrimination. And then you have the political and social costs, where we talked about in the first panel yesterday about how search you can affect elections. Well, just imagine now these digital assistants, because they can recommend to you the news that you get, the video, like the entertainment that you see, the books that you read. That's a tremendous amount of power. And that also is a cost. Now, someone say, well, how do we quantify that? We have the consumer surplus. And one of the things that would be interesting is like, oh, the consumer welfare is good. But then I would ask Austan, is like, what about DOJ cases that are brought, like the anti-poaching cases that the DOJ brought, that didn't affect consumers, that there wasn't any impact on consumer pricing. Is that still illegal under the antitrust laws? And how do you square that away with the consumer welfare standard?
I mean,
I think so.
I'm not familiar with those cases. I'm not enough of an expert to know.
The consumer are the firms who are hiring these people. Yeah, very easy.
easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Ben,
Ben, you jump in here and I'll do one.
No, I just want
we
to
want to get the questions.
I just want to
first.
I just want to note, because it's come up a few times today. Voice assistants do not continually stream audio. The way that, this is just a technical point. The way they work is they. No, it's not.
That's false. I will give you the references and I will share them with everyone, and that is false.
Ooh,
And
fun.
that case that was just mentioned in Arkansas, that was a case in which those records were produced under subpoena. Those records were produced, and there was a recording.
There is a recording when they are triggered.
No.
He's saying they don't just record 24 hours a day.
Right.
It's when someone begins to speak, they start to record.
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, I'm sorry to have interrupted, but
It's all right.
I've heard you say this before, Ben, and I admire you so much, I can't even tell you. I'm one of your biggest fans. But on this issue, you don't have enough information. Why don't I put it that way? Because in that particular case, and Maurice, maybe you would want to comment on this, but my understanding is that those recordings were provided to the court. They did exist. They had not been triggered. And I happen to know someone who the other night wrote to me and talked about a conversation he was having with his wife in which suddenly their home assistant device spoke up and actually made a comment on the conversation they were having, and it had not
Without the triggering
without the
word?
triggering.
Oh, no, sometimes it's...
And there are a couple of sources out there now in which have been documenting, people have literally just hooked up equipment to the devices and have been documenting the fact that there is a flow of information that is triggered by any sound whatsoever. So I can't tell you specifically that every single thing that's happening is being recorded, because not everything that's happening is important enough to record. But I think you're underestimating what's happening here. And again, if you have any doubts about this, begin by looking at that court case, because that was extraordinary. I mean, that led to a conviction. That recording led to a conviction in that case.
Okay.
But
I don't know where to go from
I
there.
apologize
There are
for
many
interrupting.
devices, such as your cell phone, which record a lot of information about you, like your geographic location. And the issues of privacy are critical issues. They're certainly not exclusive to Amazon, Alexas, and Google Homes. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff, as you have highlighted, where issues of privacy are important. I guess my question is does that mean, would the conclusion of that be, let us prevent the rise of these digital assistants, which so far have a market penetration that's extremely small?
Or would
we block them because they might in the future turn into a listening device by
I've
the
lost
government?
control, so
Very
we
minor
don't
point here, very minor
overhear.
point, but I just thought this would amuse you. The initial experiments we've done on the assistants show that with one response, these assistants can produce 30% shifts in opinions without anyone having any idea that they're being influenced. 30%, one response.
I mean, I think that the answer would be that you would integrate them into whatever privacy regime or whatever.
Yeah, that they would
kind
be
of
included,
They would
yes.
be part of it, and they need to be part of it. As the research shows. I want to go one more thing to Lena, and then I want to open it up to questions. We got a bit of a late start, so we'll be a few less questions than normal. One thing we haven't talked about on this panel is this idea that Amazon intimidates other companies. The idea that James Carville once said he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because you can just intimidate everybody. Now I want to be reincarnated as Amazon because I can just intimidate anybody. And a good case study is pharmacies. So Amazon sort of let slip that there was a license that was put out in Indiana to become a pharmacy. It turned out it was just for medical devices. It wasn't really for a pharmacy. All of this tumult happened around Amazon. You saw all the major pharmacy benefit managers align themselves with insurance companies. You saw Walmart align itself with Humana. This week, Amazon said, "Kidding, we're not going into pharmacies at all," and yet now they've created consolidation around them and not just by themselves. So I wonder if you can comment on this ability of Amazon to really dictate market shifts.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, going back to, honoring the fact that we're here at Chicago, right? Milton Friedman, how did he define market power? He defined it as kind of being able to control the terms of a marketplace. And I think when we think about Amazon, it's able to do that at all sorts of levels, be it in individual negotiations with publishers. As Maurice mentioned, it has a history of like tweaking the algorithms as it's negotiating with publishers to remind them how much power it has over where their books show up.
Right.
But I think this larger question of how, even suggestions or gestures by Amazon that it might enter a certain sector results in valuations of, entire grocery sectors plummeting within a matter of hours. So I think that is an extraordinary amount of power. And I think it gets to this deeper issue, which is that, in Washington, there's still this nascent conversation around, does Amazon have market power? How do we think about it? But Wall Street has been pricing Amazon's stock at valuations, at multiples that reflect market power. And I think it gets to, this interesting dynamic. I think just one more question on kind of the costs and benefits of Amazon and how we think about that. I think there's this tendency with Amazon and with Facebook and Google to kind of conflate the technological innovations with the power dynamics. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to separate those things. And in many instances, these companies have been the pioneers of certain technologies and kind of introduced them to us. But I think the fact that these technologies have also enabled them to concentrate so much power does not somehow, we should not assume that these things have to be hand in hand. We should be able to separate the technological advances from the power that these companies are concentrating. Right. My colleague Matt Stoller, said, with airlines, people are able to hold two facts in their head: the fact that the capacity to fly is awesome, but the airline companies are terrible, right? And I think being able to hold those two facts in your head with regard to these companies is something that we're still arriving towards.
Okay. Great. I think I do want to open it up at this time for questions. We're going to start down here.
With me? Oh, great.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks for this. This is, by the way, it's a great. I want to say the organizers. It's been an amazing conference. I'm sorry I couldn't come yesterday, but it's terrific. So can I have a comment and a question? Is that all right? So I want to comment. I think that it's really great to have this debate over consumer welfare because I think it is an important debate, and I think I think it may or may not be the trigger for a lot of things going forward. And sometimes I think, to respond to Gans a little bit, it has a little bit to do also with enforcement culture and what the role of the enforcers are that needs to be played into here, as opposed to what is abstractly the best, but how does it affect how law enforcement or antitrust people behave. One thing to say about consumer welfare is when you step back a little bit, it's kind of an incredibly ambitious idea because there's, particularly in the hands of an attorney or a person charged with enforcing the law, because they're supposed to have this thing which is really, everyone would agree is unmeasurable. Certainly not money, right? If you take welfare seriously, it's this idea, and we sort of want to try to make sure it's maximized, and so it's never going to be something you see. You have to sort of figure out whether or not it's getting harmed or hurt by certain situations, and it just leads you to a very abstract kind of situation, and I think generally tries to make people, tends to make enforcement officials quite timid and lean generally towards Section 1 enforcement away from Section 2 enforcement in particular. So I think that has to be taken into account. I think it's our job here. People are interested in alternatives, need to go a long way towards talking about what it would mean to have something that is enforceable and something that works, that is anyway different. But I do think, if you go back to Chicago Board of Trade and you think about what Brandeis said in that opinion as to what rule of reason was supposed to be, it's interesting what he said. He said, we need to look at these complained of conduct, and this is what you get, and ask whether it's such as enhancing competition or whether it's trying to suppress or destroy it. And so it put the law enforcement kind of a different situation, more like a referee who's calling fouls and and fair, and which is actually less ambitious. I mean, imagine you had a football referee whose job it was to maximize fan welfare in a football game. You know, how do you call that? I mean, it's almost impossible. You're like, well, fans like to see people hit each other, but on the other hand, we got to have some things that are, it's a little easier, I think, to have government in the position of calling fouls, calling strong deviations from the process of competition, and a little more respectful of the process of competition. So anyway, I think this needs a lot more work to think about, but I think we need, I keep bringing myself to think about, not abstractly, which sounds better, but embedded in an agency, what lawyers can be expected to do, and economists. This would not leave economists out of it. But I have a question. Despite complaining about the attitude towards structural remedies, I thought Jean Tirole made a great point about MFNs, and really put that point in a really clear way. And I wonder if anyone on the panel wants to talk about MFNs and whether they're already part of Amazon's business plan, whether they're a future part, and whether they are a cause of concern to people interested in
Anyone
the
take that?
economy
Sure.
and lower. I mean, just straightforward, lower prices for consumers.
Okay.
So I think the answer is, MFNs are one class of, and Fiona had a great term, contracts that reference competitors to some degree. And Amazon does use these in terms of its pricing. I exploited that by publishing a book through Amazon, putting it on Amazon for $5, and then making it available for free on Apple, which then Amazon then were responsible for dropping the price and partly compensating me for a free good. So you can do that sort of thing, but it does those things, and I've seen other authors have anomalies because of that. So we see that pervasiveness. Now the issue is it there for the purpose of some leverage of a monopoly power, and that gets a little bit harder. The times where we get concerned where there isn't obvious monopoly power is where all these MFNs, they reference each other and they interlock with one another, and they manage to keep prices high, so that even if one of them stopped doing it, it wouldn't actually affect consumer behavior, and it wouldn't affect pricing of any of them. So we worry about that somewhat. So Amazon did use some of that, but I think, and it does in the book space, but in other parts, there's clearly some wrinkles going on because prices sometimes are lower, sometimes higher than Amazon on the third-party sellers.
Maurice just mentioned to me that there was a consent decree in the European Commission regarding most favored nations and Amazon, and maybe the next panel, which is about Europe, we can address that. Okay, over here.
Would any of the panelists prevent Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Berkshire Hathaway from offering health insurance plans to a wide audience?
Excellent. Ben, I know you've written about this.
No. I mean, if there's an industry that needs more competition, I'd argue the health industry is preeminent.
Right. I'm not sure. I mean, companies self-insure all the time. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot going on there, to be honest.
I'm from Canada. What do you mean this providing health?
But it does raise the interesting issue that, let's say that it's not necessarily a horizontal merger and may not even be a vertical merger. It may not even be a merger at all if they're not in the business. But if they start getting access to that data, and that data helps them attain or maintain their dominant positions in other markets, then that could be an antitrust concern, even though we may not necessarily have the tools when we're reviewing these data-driven mergers to assess what impact it would have.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So I have one quick comment on personalized pricing. So to me, I mean, the whole discussion seems to be based on the basic premise that actually Amazon or other big companies, they will eventually figure out how much consumers are willing to pay, and they extract the whole consumer surplus. I think that kind of scenario would be correct if consumers are completely myopic and naive. Once consumers actually recognize that Amazon is engaging in that kind of personalized pricing, then now consumers will also act strategically. I mean, to give an example, let's say if you buy some product, then Amazon will recognize that you like that product, so you will pay a high price. But if you do not buy, then Amazon will give you a discount. Once consumers recognize that they will actually behave in such a way to misrepresent their willingness to pay. So actually, once they do that and the consumers respond to in strategically, actually, it doesn't pay for Amazon to engage in personalized pricing. So what I'm talking about is actually they can do, so they can do personalized pricing. That does not necessarily mean that they will actually engage in personalized pricing once they take into consideration.
And I think that's why they mostly haven't. Amazon's story has not really been
So they actually
major
did
price
once
discrimination. They
in
did
the
a
early
little.
2000s.
They have done different experiments, and they tried, and it was partly because of the both public press backlash, but also the strategic consumer behavior backlash. They just stopped buying. They've done more, and the description, I think, is quite right. It's been more about, if you're buying this, we can get you to do some other, you can buy some other things, we have a recommendation.
There's actually an
and also the
It's not
loyalty,
the price
and also the loyalty program through Prime, which is now being fed through Whole Foods.
There's an entire industry right now that's geared towards helping retailers figure out how to implement first-degree price discrimination in ways that consumers will not be able to pick up on. So, and kind of obvious mechanisms are through hyper-tailored and discounts. And Uber has actually been on the record saying that, yes, we do this. So I think it's definitely true that all these companies are very scared about consumers figuring it out. But the fact that these companies, Amazon changes prices 2 million times a day. So what is a stable price for any of us, and how will we actually know that we're paying different prices? I think that's going to be a key question going forward.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean,
Maurice?
I think that's the key issue is that once you start going to dynamic pricing, unless you're there with another person, you're both looking for that product at the same time and can see then a difference in price, it will be really hard to then distinguish dynamic pricing from discriminatory pricing. And I had this talk with the reporter the other day about Uber, and she said, yeah, unless we both stand on the same street corner and find out if we're being charged different prices, it will be really hard to see if I'm being discriminated against. And then going to Lena's point, they can do it subtly by saying, we're not going to necessarily give you a different price, but you may then get a coupon, or you may get some other inducement because you're a valued customer. And that's another way that they could then
So that's a regulatory question. Like how do you enforce a market when you can't see the price?
Yeah, the other thing I would just say to that point is I think it's very easy to underestimate one of the things the internet makes possible is dramatically increasing the volume and force of a consumer backlash. I mean, all
true.
these channels like social media makes backlash that much more of a risk, and I think is more of a constraining factor than folks might give it credit for.
That explains the incredible success of Delete Facebook.
Yeah, but when you have something like, but this was Jean's point, when you have something like an MFN, which people think, oh my God, it's getting me the lowest price, you can erase the consumer backlash. There's no there's no backlash against, hotels.com MFN, even though it's costing people 25% more. Because if you're good about
it's a very fair point. I just meant
whether you can see it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
All right, we have time for just one more question. Just looking for anyone who hasn't spoken before, but seeing none, I'll go to you now.
So I just want to ask a question about pricing, but the latest issue of the Chicago Booth Review, the cover story is, are you ready for personalized pricing?
And this is where I always know that Matt wasn't here on time, because I brought this up.
That's it.
I think Luther's got a good question.
Yeah, so now we have time for real questions. So
I have a
ready for
question.
that question.
I actually, that wasn't
okay.
that was my, I was trying to make everyone laugh, which was successful. So it's about predatory pricing, because one of Lena's key insights in her paper was about the use of predatory pricing, or the non-enforcement of predatory pricing rules, and the imposition of the recoupment test, which says you can only prove predatory pricing if you can show that the merchant is trying to recoup their profit later by charging a higher price for that same good. So I'm wondering, particularly Lena and Maurice, how do you think about recoupment in an age of algorithms, personalized pricing, complexity of these institutions like Amazon, which is in so many areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recoupment challenge, which exists even outside of digital markets, is heightened in the digital market context because our ability to discern whether a company is in fact recouping becomes all that much more difficult. There have been some great proposals out there by like Christopher Leslie and Sandeep Vaheesan that identify, what a predatory pricing doctrine would look like without a recoupment test. So I think I think predatory pricing doctrine has been broken for some time, and I think that's becoming all the more clear with companies like Amazon. I don't know if Maurice has other things.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, it seems like, because first of all, the EU doesn't have the recoupment if it's below average variable cost. And then second, it seems a little bit paternalistic, the Brook Group case, because there the company had the anti-competitive intent. It was also charging below the appropriate measure of cost. And then the court then interceded and said, no, there was no realistic opportunity for recoupment. And I remember the dissent there said, well, this industry knew how to do that dance. And yet we're sort of superimposing our view that it was not possible. And as a result, it's really been the death knell of predatory pricing. So I think empirical work on this front would be really helpful to see whether or not our standard is correct and to have the court reevaluate it.
And I think the fact that embedded in predatory pricing doctrine right now is the idea that companies are short-term profit maximizers is also something that the platforms are challenging, given that these are winner-take-all markets that in fact very much incentivize pursuing growth over profit in the short term.
Okay.
I would just
Yep.
I was going to double down on that.
trying to end it.
If the goal for Amazon is to build out this sort of entity that is a platform for decades, what is the time horizon on measuring?
What do they care about next year's spend? All right. Well, thank you. We've just scratched the surface, really, on Amazon, I think. So this will be next year's entire conference.
Thank you.